This is the Enjoyer Podcast. I'm your host, James Dixon.
Make Detroit build again is a constant theme of the Enjoyer Podcast. And so I was watching, just like everyone else, we at the Enjoyer, we can call it the State of the State or the State of the Union address. We can call it that. The media doesn't call it that. We know that was obviously the State of the Union we saw last week. And so I watched it and I heard Trump talk about making America re-industrial again. I heard him talk about auto workers 5 different times. But when he talked about jobs specifically, the jobs weren't coming to Michigan. They were going to Indiana. You know, Honda has a big presence in Ohio, a big presence in Indiana, and these jobs always skip past Michigan. It seems that if we do get auto jobs in Michigan, they're either big 3 jobs, which are usually attached to big corporate welfare payouts, or lately it's these Chinese firms. It's Goshen they want to do on the west side of the state. It's CATL partnering with Ford at Blue Oval Battery Park. It's not what you want to see, and it's certainly not a big reputable company like Honda. Watching the State of the Union address was a sobering realization that America could reindustrialize without Michigan necessarily getting those jobs. The future is going to happen, but you have Indiana, you have Ohio, you have the South, then you have all these places outside of America. The playing field is much different than we've ever known it. So even with an attempt to reindustrialize America, it won't necessarily benefit Michigan. Those jobs could go elsewhere. Our history in the auto industry isn't any birthright of the future. So my guest today, Marick Masters, is going to help us understand this new era, this attempt to make America build again, and Michigan's place in it if we do have a place. Masters is former director of labor at Wayne. He's working on a book called The New UAW. Marick, welcome to the Enjoyer Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, James. It's a pleasure to be here this morning.
Well, I really thank you for taking the time. From your biography, I see that your dad also taught at Wayne State. And so you came back as an adult, you had some training elsewhere, and then came back as an adult to work. What years are we talking about? What do you remember about Detroit in its heyday?
My dad was a political scientist, and I was born in Madison, Wisconsin. He got his degree at the University of Wisconsin in 1955. I was born in 54. We came here in 1956, and we lived in Dearborn. My sister actually was born in Dearborn. He taught at Wayne State University in the political science department until 1959, when Wayne State, for I think most of that time, was Wayne University, not Wayne State University.
Right.
So we go back a long way. He wrote articles on the United Auto Workers. And then after that, his immediate job, right after that, he went to Washington, D.C. and worked with Senator Phil Hart. And he's
that's
had
the guy Hart
history.
Plaza is named after. People think it's just Hart Plaza for no reason. No, it's Senator Phil Hart. I believe
there's a
he
Hart
died.
Senate building in Washington, D.C. I mean, he was a very big deal, and well-respected, well-known. So my dad spent time after that in Congress, working off and on until he left academia and then went to Congress. And I came back here in 2009, and I was at Pittsburgh, the University of Pittsburgh. And I'll be honest with you, when I told people I was thinking about going to Wayne State, they said, "You don't want to go to Detroit. You don't want to go to Detroit." And I thought, I came here, and I really liked it. And I liked the university, and I decided, labor at Wayne was a good opportunity. I got to work with working class people and the auto workers. And so that was why I took the job, and I've been here for 15 years.
What makes someone come back to Detroit at the height of the recession? I mean, 2009 is one of the terrible years when you think about Michigan history, labor history. I mean, just the idea of Detroit, the auto industry, and the idea of Detroit, the city, were both very much struggling at that point in time. We just come off the auto bankruptcies of the industry, and we're only years from the bankruptcy of the city. What made you think, got to move to Detroit?
Well, I was told that by many people. They said the auto industry's in the tank, labor's in the tank, Detroit's in the tank, and why are you going there? And I said, there's no place to go but up. And so that's why I came here.
Is that true?
It's turned around. I went to Pittsburgh in 1986, which was after the steel industry really collapsed. But in Pittsburgh at that time was a very depressed area and still very depressed. I actually ran for Congress in 1992 in Pittsburgh, and I spent the district that I was running in included the Mon Valley, which was the depressed area. And it was incredibly depressed. It's really the home base of Senator Sederman. And I can see where he comes from in terms of, how he's reoriented himself a little bit in terms of working class. He comes from very economically depressed areas. When you go to parts of Detroit, I saw the same sort of thing in Pittsburgh. And when you went along the riverside in Pittsburgh, up until, the year 2000, it was just a bunch of decayed steel mills.
Right.
That's all you saw. And many of the people that worked at the University of Pittsburgh at the clerical level, wherever, were people whose husbands had lost their jobs in the steel industry. They were housewives, so to speak, raising kids, but they had to come back to work to support their families. Mm-hmm. And that was, the situation. And you could tell it when you went through the communities, the devastation in the steel towns that were ghost towns, essentially.
Make Detroit Build Again is a theme of this podcast. I worry after what we heard the other night, after Donald Trump's speech, that with Michigan not being a right-to-work state anymore, after a decade of that status, I worry that Michigan's not in position to win the future, that as America looks to re-industrialize, those opportunities could go elsewhere into places that are not tied into Shawn Fain specifically. Do you think that could be an obstacle as we look to bring these jobs back back stateside?
Well, if you look at rebuilding the auto industry in the U.S., one of the things you have to realize is that a lot of the growth that has taken place over the past decade in terms of the recovery of the auto industry has occurred among non-union firms, many of which are located outside of Michigan. So probably one of the biggest creators of jobs in the industry is Elon Musk with Tesla. Right. And then you have other companies, Lucid and Rivian, which are in various states of development that are in the non-union sphere of electrical vehicles. And you also have a very large cadre of foreign-based companies, Volkswagen, Toyota, Honda, et cetera, that have invested heavily in the southern region and in Indiana and other states, so that when they make plans to invest in the U.S., they often make them outside of Michigan, and they're building supply chains in that area. And the supply chains are very connected to Canada and Mexico. We import a large volume of auto products, auto parts, and auto vehicles from Mexico. So it makes sense to have facilities that are close to that border in terms of trying to shrink the time period in which you can get your supplies. I think that Michigan has a future. Right to work is part of it, but it's a small part of it. What it signals is a climate that is less friendly to business.
Yes.
And I think that's part of the broader issue sweep of things. And I think Trump's reindustrialization policy includes the tariffs, which are partly a negotiating tactic, but partly an effort to change the so-called world order so that it's more fair to the United States and other countries as well. But it's also to reduce the footprint of government so that it is less expensive to do business. And I would say that one of the very interesting things, just to piggyback on what you said earlier, which I think is so true, when Trump came here in the campaign and he engaged in a verbal tug of war with Sean Fain, I would say that one of the things that he pointed out, which was most salient to me, was when he said, the auto worker strike is okay, but it doesn't matter because the industry is going to China. And Elon Musk had said that in a short period of time, probably 9 of the 10 largest auto manufacturing companies are going to be based in China. And if you look at the fact that the largest auto market in the world by far is China, it's, 50% larger than the U.S. market. The companies that are the legacy companies in Detroit, in Michigan, which we're dependent on, are a small sliver of the overall international motor vehicle production industry. And they have been shrinking continually since the 1970s. And look at the UAW as symptomatic of that. In 1979, it had 1.5 million members.
Man.
500,000 in GM. When GM got a cold, the whole state got a cold. The whole country got a cold.
Yes.
And now GM has about 46,000 hourly auto workers. And Ford has 48,000, maybe a little bit more than that now, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what they had before. And so when these companies, they're not talking about growing exponentially or climbing to those recent levels. We've seen manufacturing shrink as a share of the labor force from about 22% to 10% since the mid-1980s. And that shrinkage has been going on for decades before that. So how do you bring it back? And I think what Trump is saying, we bring it back by reducing what I'll call the footprint of government. And this is not only reducing the size of federal employment, which is costly, but more than that, I think the critical variable here is government regulation, which costs the economy trillions of dollars, large and small businesses, environmental regulations, other kinds of regulations. You go through the regulations that you have to meet in order to get permits to develop a factory, and in order to build products. All of those kinds of things hinder business. And I think what he wants to do is say, let's take our tax rates, reduce them. Let's take other things that affect business adversely, such as regulations that don't make any sense, that are not understandable. We are the most litigious and regulated country. They want to regulate everything about us now. And I think he epitomized that, Trump did, in which he said, no more EV mandates. And one of the things I found really kind of sad on the political campaign was that liberals and leftists would say, well, there's no EV mandate. We're not telling you have to buy a car. Well, no, you're not telling us we have to buy a particular car, but you're just saying you can't produce a car and comply with environmental regulations unless you produce an electrical vehicle going into the future. And they set ambitious goals. They spent a lot of money and time and effort on the electrification, and the public wasn't ready for it. And that got the auto companies in a bit of a...
I look at Ford. They were losing billions of dollars and still doing EV, still pushing it. Which leads me to think, if a company is willing to lose billions of dollars per year doing something, they're not serving the customer anymore. So who are they serving? And what consequence must they fear more than losing billions of dollars? And both those answers lead back to government.
Well, I think I think that hits the nail on the head. Government was the constituency they were serving.
Right.
And I think that when the political climate began to change a little bit, they said, maybe we should change our accent. We're not going to change our basic direction of policy or admit that, but we're not going to proceed as rapidly toward that because we just can't economically. And I think that's the situation that they caught themselves in. Toyota said all along that it wanted to rely more on a mixed strategy focusing on hybrids as a transition period. I think that there were things that could be done if they had responded to market forces. And I understand the need for environmental regulations to protect the environment and appreciate all of that. But you have to have common sense when you do this and realize that there are limits to technical change and the capacity for doing so. And you want to push it by certain kinds of incentives. But I'm not certain that we were ready for the rapid shift that they wanted to impose on really the economy and put the economy in a bit of a straitjacket.
You know, something that puzzles me right now is we had in Michigan a decade of right to work. There is a track record that could be evaluated and say, this was the net effect. This is the story of the right to work era. This is the story of the lost decade before it. And this is what we can anticipate now going back into the Granholm era type policies. And am I accurate in saying that no one's telling that story in Michigan? Like, what would the average person think that the net effect was of a decade of right to work? I don't think that number's out there. I don't think that argument's being made by anyone. But if you could speak to that, what could we say was the story of right to work? Yeah.
There have been studies done on the effects of right to work on economic development, economic progress, those kinds of things. And I would say that the viewpoint is mixed. A lot depends on the value perspective that people bring to the equation beforehand in terms of how they do the research, whether they lean towards the union side or whether they lean towards the right to work side.
Right.
But I would say the most overriding thing to keep in mind is in auto, even though you have right to work, most of the workplaces where the UAW is represented, you have wall-to-wall union membership because the peer pressure is so heavy that people join the union. In the public sector, particularly at the state and local level, for example, you look at police and fire, you look at teachers, you have the same kinds of pressures. And those are two areas where you have relatively high level of unionization. But in Michigan, in 1960, about 50% of the workforce in Michigan was unionized. 15% of it is today.
Wow.
In 1955, in the U.S. as a whole, and it was much more heavily private sector than now, but you had about 35% of the workforce that was unionized. Today, you have less than 10% that is unionized. And in the private sector, you have less than 6% that is unionized. So really, when I look at unions, they're lucky to some extent they have a place at the table because I think when the major decisions that are made economically at the national level, unions don't have a place at the table. For example, when they were talking about the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership of a decade or so ago, unions were really not involved in the negotiation of those things. Now, Trump has brought the UAW into discussions about tariffs, and I think that
they're on his side.
They're on his side, yes. And one thing Donald Trump isn't bashful about saying, if you're not on my side, you're against me, and I know how to deal with enemies.
And if you agree with me, I will bear hug you with that agreement.
I will bear hug you, and he's a business tycoon developer. People in that business are not nice. I mean, they're not singing around the campfire, holding hands and saying everything's wonderful. No, they're saying, how can I get the best deal today,
Yes.
right now?
Yes.
And that's what motivates him. Now, that means he's very transactional in terms of how he deals with people. And sometimes I think this is part of his problem right now in terms of public relations. And people are always going, he's going to have a segment of the world that's always opposed to anything that he does. But I think now he seems to, in policy, zigging and zagging, going back and forth, and people say it doesn't seem to lack any coherence or direction. And I think he's got a communication problem. He just hasn't packaged what he's doing now well, I think, to give people that he's being more thoughtful than meets the eye. There's a madness, there's a method to his madness, if you will.
You know, as we talk about re-industrializing, I'm 40 next week. Literally, next Monday, I turn 41. When I was a kid, I would still, you'd look at your T-shirt that was made in New York City, and we still talked about Detroit as Motor City, and not it used to be. And not with any irony, like it was still a proud thing in my lifetime. I remember it. And that was before NAFTA. How did we come to deindustrialize in the first place? It just doesn't make sense when you look at what made Detroit great in the first place. It wasn't logging, it was the auto industry. How do you decide to roll back that to where by the 2000s everyone was talking about service economy, and even today Garland Gilchrist running for governor talking about the jobs of the future, everyone's going to be working on laptops. Why did we roll back in the first place?
Well, there's been a fundamental change in the nature of production, the nature of consumption, and as a result of that, we, just like the shift away from an agricultural-based society, we shift from a manufacturing-based society to a different society in terms of the dominance of certain factors of production.
Right.
And while the newer forms of production are often labor-intensive, such as government and healthcare and education, they don't provide, the pay levels that certain manufacturing jobs did for workers that were otherwise left out. And people could always get a job if they didn't want to go to junior high school or college. They could get a job in the auto industry or in the steel industry, and they could make a decent living and they could support a family.
Right.
But when international competition, after World War II, we helped build the world economy. We were by far the dominant economy, and we rebuilt Europe, we rebuilt Japan, or we rebuilt them to a large extent with our help. And those countries then became our competitors. And so Japan entered the market. Yeah. We weren't prepared for it. I think
they became the second and third strongest economies.
Yes, they did. And so I remember when I grew up, a little thinking back to history, I'm 70 years old. And I remember very well from the 60s, we used to make fun of Japanese products. We considered Japanese products junk.
Same way we talk about Chinese stuff now.
It was
wow.
And then all of a sudden, we realized that their automobiles are pretty good. Right. And they caught us, in the crosshairs, and the energy crisis of the 70s really magnified that. And our companies weren't ready to compete at that level. And we had higher labor costs, we had inefficient production models, and we also had lack of quality standards, which I think made us lose a large share of the market. But some of these forces were just a shift in the center of gravity. And what we see now is a shift in the center of gravity in industry and manufacturing, and in overall economic situations from the U.S. and the European Union to Asia. And you look at the top 10 countries now in terms of GDP, four of them are Asian. You have China, Japan, you have South Korea, India. So these countries are really the future. And that's where I think we have to position ourselves if we want to compete in the future, that we've got to bring those companies. I think the future relies on companies to partner, to get companies to want to invest in the United States. There's no way that GM and Ford in their current positions are going to be able to compete in China and India on the scale that they will need to bring back the kinds of jobs. I don't think Trump can talk about bringing the level of jobs back. I think what he wants to talk about is a domestic capacity that is far greater than what we have now, that will feed into national security and provide more opportunities for people. But during his first term and during Biden's term, you didn't see significant growth in auto employment. And the growth that you saw was often in states outside of Michigan, not inside Michigan.
I think back to NAFTA. I think about the rise of China. You know, they're allowed to join the World Trade Organization. And from what you're saying, reading between the lines, it sounds like from all these post-World War II scenarios, whether it's Japan, China, or Germany, the hope was to turn all these people into consumers. Was that if we get everyone else going, like America-led world economy is fine, but not an America-only world economy. You wanted there to be someone else who could buy these products. And it sounds like at some point things got flipped around to where we decided Mexico and China should build the stuff, not just be consumers for the stuff. Did something go wrong at some point, or was the plan always this?
I think from a business standpoint, it was an economically rational decision. The price of labor was so relatively low that it became much more advantageous competitively to invest in countries with lower wage structures. And that's one of the reasons why the revised United States, Mexico, Canada trade agreement that was done during the first Trump administration provided for certain requirements with respect to wage levels that you had to meet in order to comply with those tariff reductions. And
it couldn't just be a crazy undercut.
Yeah. And what I want to say, though, is I think the real problem that we've had in the United States, we don't talk about it much because it's not popular in the mainstream media. The mainstream media is incapable of being honest with itself. That's my sense.
Yes.
And we are into, and I've seen this in organizations that I've been involved. I've been a management consultant. I've seen this in a lot of organizations. We are into managing decline. We're okay with decline. We have a declining market share. That's okay, as long as we can still keep on making a little bit of money and pay our bonuses and pay our dividends. We're fine with that. And look at, in the 1960s, you had GDP annual growth rates. During the Kennedy administration, the high point of it was 6.1% per year.
6%.
In Johnson administration, I believe it was 1965, you had a GDP growth rate of 6.6% annually. During Reagan's presidency, I believe it was 83 or 84, you had a growth rate of 7.1%. Now, 7.1% of a $30 trillion economy, which we have now, is a pretty large number. If you can raise we've had anemic growth rate since then. And you had better growth rates under the Clinton administration. But even under the first Trump administration, the peak of the growth rate was 3%. Now they're estimating that over the next year, we might have 2%, something like that. If we can bring that up to 4%, you can go a long way towards solving your problems with respect to budget deficits and providing higher wages, as long as there's increasing productivity. And I don't think we use our workers well enough to get as much productivity out of them as we can. So I think we need to have a rethink in terms of how we manage our workforce. But there is the potential. I think what we have done is just accept that a lower rate of growth, a lower standard of living, those kinds of things, relatively speaking, are okay with us. And we'll just continually spend our time investing more in government programs that consume much more of our GDP. And government isn't a necessarily productive entity.
You know, I think about this shift and this, economically rational decision that there's cheaper workers elsewhere. Why not go get them? Which is fine as far as it goes, but to me, NAFTA encouraged these things. To me, I look at our national policy as encouraging companies to go get the cheap labor. Not just it exists and you're allowed to go get it. You were pushed in that direction. And it just strikes me as fairly obvious that if the jobs move from Flint to Guadalajara, yeah, those people are going to be better off in Guadalajara, but obviously we're going to be worse off in Flint. Michael Moore used to talk about this. Were these ideas ever thought to be, were these ideas ever embraced by the average person, or was this always economic elites and political elites making these choices for the rest of us?
I would say it's been mainly the decision-making is done by the political elite. And it's been done by members of both parties.
Right.
One of the sea changes that I've seen politically in the United States is the shift in the Republican Party's position on trade.
Oh, yeah.
Ronald Reagan was a pure free trader. And he identified more with the working class than your typical Republican president, except for maybe Richard Nixon. There were the Reagan Democrats from the Macomb County area that people resonate with in terms of Reagan's identification with the working class. But he was very much a free trader. George Bush was very much a free trader. Bill Clinton was very much a free trader. When I ran for Congress in 1992, I ran on a platform opposed to the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I was kind of a lone wolf, so to speak. Clinton was for the North American Free Trade Agreement. George Bush was for it. The only one who was running then at the time who was against it was Ross Perot.
Right.
And he said it's going to be this giant sucking sound. Yes. And I think that that's what we realized, that we're okay with exporting jobs. We're okay with importing cheaper labor through visas so that we get people here. We don't have to pay them as much as we would. When we have call centers open, we open them in other countries rather than here, so that you can get cheaper labor. It's a very common practice. And what Trump is saying is, I want to reorder that. And I want people to have in their thinking America first. And that is a political statement that I think is the centerpiece of his whole policy framework, from a national defense, economic prosperity, government reform perspective.
What I find fascinating about this is that it's not that the left won this argument. It's not a "we are the world" sentiment, that led to that. It's free trade. Free trade is what what ultimately hurt the Detroit model of prosperity, which is that American men would make man-sized wages, and you would think that this is some kind of Democrat sentiment, even a communist sentiment, that jobs should be able to flow anywhere and that these people need these jobs more. But we're thinking about it from the perspective of the guy who owns the company. It's better for him if the workers are cheaper. So heck with everyone else.
Historically, we've always had a very balanced approach towards tariffs. In the 19th century, most of the federal government's revenue came from tariffs. There were huge debates between the parties then over tariffs and money, whether it be hard or paper money. Currency debates were very vocal at that time and centerpiece in the electoral campaigns for president and for Congress. The Republicans in the 19th century, from Lincoln to McKinley, were protectionists. They believed in protecting American industry. And they had a different view of the world, and they thought that countries had an interest in protecting certain industries over a certain time horizon, and certainly doing what they could to develop those industries that were essential to our economic security and also our national security.
Right.
And that, when the mantra of free trade, the mantra of free markets rolled out those kinds of things, it was really done to, I think, help the elites make decisions that would benefit the corporate bottom line, and the worker bottom line sort of went by the wayside. And we saw devastations in communities. People, in the abstract theoretical sense, free trade is good because it will lead to more efficient production if you have fewer barriers across countries, whether they be tariff or non-tariff barriers. But the situation is such that there will be losers, and the workers have been the losers.
Yeah.
And I think there's a realization that that's unfair, and that workers shoulder a large part of the burden when it comes to wars. It's your working class people and your lower class people, so to speak, they go to war because they don't have the options. And they're more, I think, they're very patriotic in terms of their approach towards worldviews. And I think as a result of that, they've borne a large share of the burden of our national defense policies, our international policies over the past 2 decades, which have spent a lot of treasure and a lot of blood in life.
Yeah, I think about Henry Ford. I talk about Henry Ford a lot. Put the world on wheels. It basically is the reason there are black people in Michigan. And so Henry Ford, a century ago, wanted this American model of prosperity that did not necessarily involve labor unions. Like, I'll take care of you. The old man, the old industrialist will take care of you, but do not saddle me with a union. You had the most successful industrialist in the country, a man who brought in the modern world. Why did the UAW win that battle in the end?
I think because the workplace conditions were so bad, the management was onerous, and it was a time, particularly during the Great Depression, when people were looking for a way to uplift their standard of living. And it was a confluence of events, economic and political, that led to the emergence of the so-called industrial union, which would include the auto workers, the steel workers. And they, through collective bargaining agreements and their economic power, which led to them, built the middle class. They raised wages, they provided benefits. Those kinds of things, I think, were considered part of the equation or the social compact between business and labor at that time. But it's important to remember that at that time, particularly after World War II, the United States was the dominant force in the world. We had more than 90% of the market share in the auto industry. We had the lion's share in steel production. That's no longer the case. And as a result of that, we're in a much more difficult position in terms of relying on one single industry or set of industries. And with technology and other efficiencies in production, they don't need as many people to produce what they did before. But they do need a lot of ancillary jobs. You need a lot of research and development jobs. You need a lot of technical jobs and those kinds of things.
Right.
People that could work in the space of computers, artificial intelligence, those kinds of services and production of relevant equipment can provide an opportunity for people going forward. I think we've got to let the market determine that in the U.S. and create a climate that encourages it. That's why I'm very keen on reducing the footprint of government and regulation, reducing the footprint of government in terms of its consumption of the economy, in which it takes so much in taxes. Right now, the federal government takes about 22% of GDP. Government as a whole takes, closer to 40% of GDP.
Jeez.
That's a huge amount. And I think what we are realizing now with Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiencies, and there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of turmoil associated with that. But at least they're looking at waste, fraud, and abuse, and they're identifying it. You can go to a website that they produce. Where have you ever seen this before? You have a website from the government that says, this is the amount of fraud and waste that we've identified. And if you go look at some of the contracts, we not only have, and they really haven't focused on this yet, but when they get to it, they will be overwhelmed with waste, fraud, and abuse. When they look at the military-industrial complex, when they look at the Pentagon, there will be so much waste, fraud, and abuse there that it will boggle the mind. But there are other complexes in society besides military-industrial. There's an environmental industrial complex, which has increasingly channeled money into climate change initiatives.
There's a homeless industrial complex.
There is a educational industrial complex. There is a healthcare industrial complex. There is a cultural industrial complex aimed at changing cultural values through grants that go to government entities and nonprofits. When we look at, Trump called it a swamp. When you look at the mass of programs, it's been, there's what I call government creep. It just creeps up. It gets larger and larger and larger and larger. And what we have realized now is we've got ourselves in a real mess. We have $36 trillion in debt. We spend $1 trillion a year at the federal level on interest on the debt. That drowns out opportunities to spend things for other things. We've got a bloated defense budget, a bloated education budget, a bloated healthcare budget. And because we don't focus on the right things, we focus on delivering healthcare rather than getting people healthy. If you shifted the focus, you could reduce the cost of healthcare. If you could reduce the influence of the big pharmas and others in perpetuating this system in which we are so dependent upon drugs of various kinds for our medical treatments, that the costs have skyrocketed. And people pay for it. If you're on Medicare, you realize you pay for a lot. And we have essentially a heavily government-subsidized healthcare industry, which I don't think delivers a lot of value in terms when you look at what it's producing on the basis of the quality of health.
You said something really interesting earlier, talking about anemic growth rates for decades now. And I think that contrasts with what Elon Musk is doing and Doge, right? So is it a sign of the times that we're not talking about growing the economy? No one's talking about 5% growth. No one's talking about 7% growth. They're talking about cutting billions and billions here out of a budget that is trillions. Is that a sign of the times that America is not necessarily going to grow, but that all of our energy is focused on cuts?
I think that the philosophy behind the Trump economic program and its government reform program is economic growth. America's golden era is on the horizon, is what he said. And by that, I think he means accelerated economic prosperity across the board, not just for those at the upper strata.
Right.
I think that what he's done a poor job of doing and what his supporters have done a poor job of doing is accentuating that. And he needs to tie in why he wants to reduce the scope of government to economic growth and be concrete about that and saying, we want to get growth up. We want to see growth at 4%, at 5%. Now, I know there are economists and others who are going to say that's not doable. And I would say that is not true at all. Other countries have done it. We can do it. We have the capacity to be much more productive than we are. I see it every day in organizations I go into. People are not working as hard as they can. They want work-life balance, and I appreciate that, and I understand that. But the more leisure you want, the less economic growth and prosperity you're going to have. That's the reality. And we need to think in terms of how can we work smarter? How can we be more productive with tools that are more efficient, that make it more efficient and give us a higher capacity to perform? That's the way I look at it. And I think if we can change the frame of mind, say, let's demand that we grow at a higher level. Let's turn things around and not be comfortable with decline and say, we can do better. When I look at John F. Kennedy, one of the reasons why that he was so popular at the time was he called us to do more.
Yeah.
It's summarized in his well-known phrase, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I think by that he was saying not only in terms of military service, but when you go to work and you're working for your country, you're building a country, you're building a future. And they wanted to win. They realized that to win the war against communism, they had to not only win it militarily, but economically and ideologically.
Even the presidential fitness test with kids. I mean, it is literally.
I remember I
all
went through
100 million Americans, or however many existed back then. Everyone has an assignment to be stronger. Yeah.
That we had to do all these fitness things in gym and we had to run and do all those kinds of things. And then now, yes. But it was good for us. I mean, in the sense that, and I think that's part of what I mean by saying we need to focus on health and getting people back to being healthy so that we will be less dependent on the need for medical aid in the form of drugs and surgeries and all those other kinds of things that if we were healthier, we wouldn't have to have. I think we can reorient our thinking. I think that's what I think is necessary. If we had elected the Democrats in 2024, we would have continued to do the same things.
Right.
And continued to go down the same path. And I say this, I was a lifelong Democrat. I changed parties after the election. Not because
this election just now?
Just this election at 70.
Wow.
Yeah. I need this about as much as I need a hole in the head. I don't intend on running for office again. I don't want to get in political debates with everybody.
Fun fact, Marick, the person you ran against in 1992, if I recall, was Rick Santorum.
Yes.
So you were running as a Democrat, running against Santorum. You could have stopped the Rick Santorum era. You could have saved Fox News viewers many years of Rick Santorum had you beaten him in that race and he never gained power.
That was the plan. And in fact, I ran against him. One of the things I ran against him on, basically, I didn't get the nomination, but I ran in the Democratic primary. And the guy that got the nomination was a Republican who switched to being a Democrat at the last minute. And he only got 37% of the vote in the election against Santorum. I kind of knew that was going to happen. And then his chief of staff got elected in 1994 and was in Congress for 20 years after that. But I filled in for debates when the Democratic nominee said, I don't really want a debate Santorum. After he got the nomination, he said, you go do it. And so I filled in the debate and had a couple of skirmishes with then Congressman Santorum. And now I find myself thinking more along the Rick Santorum lines than I did then. But I was still opposed to NAFTA, and he was for it. And so I used to chase him around about that a bit, saying, how can you be for NAFTA? It's not really for this district. It's not good for the workers in this district. And he was pretty evasive, I would think, at that time about it. But nonetheless, what I've seen is that the parties have sort of switched. The Democrats have become more of an elitist party, a credentialed party.
Oh, yeah.
And very, very much into identity politics rather than working class politics. And I'm, subscribe to a lot of things along the Democratic side of the aisle in terms of their historical approach towards government and society. I'm a big fan of Hubert Humphrey. I'm a big fan of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy. And to me, it's almost unbelievable that Robert Kennedy Jr. can stand up at the State of the Union address and there's not a single Democrat that would stand up and applaud.
Right. Unthinkable.
Robert Kennedy Sr. was an icon in the Democratic Party, worshipped by many people. And that sort of sentiment has gone by. But people don't look at what they really stood for. And he called on people to make sacrifices for the country. He was very critical of what he considered to be sort of the elitist framework then that led to kids that were wealthy enough to go to college that didn't have to serve in the war with student deferments. He really called people out on that. And that's the kind of thing that I don't think you see happening a lot today.
Absolutely. You're working on a book now called The New UAW. So I'd like to ask you what's new about it. My theory is that the old UAW, and this may not be what you talk about at all, but I'd like to hear what you think as well as what you've done. But my theory is that the old UAW, Walter Reuther, they were there to secure the prosperity of their workers. And those negotiations were fundamentally about how much should my workers get paid when they do work? How much should they work? That kind of thing. It was about what we do. It was about work. Whereas now with Shawn Fain, I see this guy talking about eat the rich. I see this guy talking about he wants a global general strike on May 1st, 2028. I see him having all these interests that are global and not about what's good for the workers he represents. And so that's what I see as the old and the new UAW is, are they interested in actual prosperity or are they just essentially here to rabble rouse? What say you?
I think that when you look at the negotiations that took place in 2023, they were focused almost singularly on economics. They were focused on wages. They were focused on cost of living. They were focused on plant closures, investments in the companies, tiers, those kinds of things. But when it comes to rhetoric today, I think the unfortunate reality is the rhetoric on the part of a lot of union leaders in order to appeal to their base, or at least they think they need to appeal to their base, is more strident. Eat the rich. I don't take them in a literal sense at that. It's figurative. I understand that. But I don't think it helps.
Right. It's not positive.
I think what you want to do is say, we want to grow the pie for workers.
Yes.
This is what I think Walter Reuther would say. he would say, I want more for workers, and I'm going to do what we need to do to get more for workers. And if that means we go out on strike for a long period of time, that's what we'll do. But I want but I know that for workers to get more, the companies have to do better.
You didn't have to hate Bill Ford to want a better deal for your guys. And I feel like it's driven by the hate and not the love anymore.
I think that you hit the nail on the head right there, and that's what I disdain about today's politics. And that's one of the reasons why I left the Democratic Party, and I feel that it's filled with too many whining, mean-spirited people that are hateful. And I think Trump deranged syndrome is part of that. That people just hate Donald Trump so much that they can't think that he could conceivably do anything any good or any of his policies.
If Trump said to breathe, they would hold their breath. You have to be able to say, even if a person I don't like says that today is Tuesday, that today is still Tuesday. You have to have that maturity. And Democrats don't even have that anymore.
That has gone by the wayside. That's one of the unfortunate things about politics. I'm not certain exactly when it started. It was before Trump, but it certainly escalated since he came down the escalator, so to speak, in 2015. And it's gotten worse ever since, to where now you have Democrats that sit really on their duffs during an entire State of the Union, and regardless of what he says, they won't even lift a finger and support, whether it's in the common interest of the nation or not. And I think that's the division that we see right now. I grew up in an era in which that wasn't the case. The people that ran for president, they had strong disagreements, but they didn't hate each other. And what we see now is that there is a unwillingness to communicate across the aisle, across the ideological divide. And I've seen it happen in many families that I know, in many situations that I know. That you say anything, you're gonna be punished. And this is another difference.
You'll be punished if you don't hate Trump enough.
You will be, and if you say anything for him, you can be punished. And I think that that's where we've got to draw the line. Say that as long as you're not, humiliating anybody, bullying anybody, or unnecessarily offending them with foul language, and common sense tells us what you should and shouldn't say.
Right.
That as long as you're trying to have a civil discourse, you should be able to disagree without having vitriol and being subject to attack. In some cases, it's so extreme that it's almost physical attack. People get very angry to the point that they can't control themselves. We've got to put a stop to that. That's nonsense.
Absolutely. We'll get you out of here on this one, Marick. What do you enjoy about Michigan, A, and where can people find more about yourself and your work, B?
Well, what I enjoy, it sounds trite, but I really like the people. I like the working class mentality. I love the Motown and Motor City vibe about Michigan. I like the topography. I like the geography. I like the natural resources. I like the fact that it's the center of the auto industry. Those kinds of things I really find very appealing about it.
Yeah.
And it's just, to me, it's a great place to live, and it's a great place to raise a family. I wouldn't have come here if I didn't think that it was good. I have 5 kids. I have 7 grandkids now. Most of my grandkids aren't here. Most of them are still in the Pittsburgh area, but Pittsburgh's a lot like Detroit in the sense that it suffered economically. It's come back, and I want to see Detroit and Michigan prosper in the future.
Absolutely.
And if they want to follow me, they can just Google me, and I have a podcast that I do on the federal sector. Go to my YouTube channel. You can see the various things I do there. In terms of, I do podcasts on the UAW Watch, Federal Sector Watch. I follow developments in government efficiency and those kinds of things, labor management relations. You can find me on YouTube and on just through Google search. You can find my writings and things like that.
You knocked something loose for me, and I'd love to have you back to talk about this. You knocked something loose talking about how it was the free marketers who talked us out of nativism. I'd never thought about it that way, but I think that's going to be one of those rubber meets road moments as the Trump years go on, is the free market, Mitt Romney, Rick Snyder kind of roots of the party against the original roots of the party, the protectionists, the America First. I don't care how it benefits the businessman. I care how it benefits the American man. And I think that's going to come to a head. So I would love to have you back to understand how that all came to be and what's going to happen next.
Well, I'd love to come back. Thanks for having me so much. It was great meeting you today. I wish you all the best, and I hope that our paths cross again in the near future.